Do you know that if you live or travel to this city in China, every detail about your life is already captured and on a Chinese database somewhere waiting to be needed in the future by the Communist Party of China? I bet you've never thought of that. This is Chongqing, a city with more than 2.5 million cameras watching over almost 15 million people. But what if I told you this isn't even the most surveilled city in the world? As it turns out, China is not even among the list of the top 5 most surveilled countries in the world. That will be Malta, Singapore, Germany, UK, and the United States. I can assure you, wherever you live in the world, your government has some way of monitoring your every move without you even knowing about it. But how much of that is safe? In my research into mass surveillance carried out by governments and big corporations, I uncovered something that will interest you. And if you watch until the end, I have some tips for how you can escape this new reality we find ourselves in. In the fall of 2001, President George W. Bush authorized the National Security Agency to begin a program that will allow the government to spy on its citizens without the need for a warrant. This was clearly in violation of the law, as it would grant the government access to every private information about all citizens, whether criminal or not. This program was kept secret for 4 years, that is 2005, when the New York Times disclosed its existence to the general public. Now in panic mode, President Bush and his administration quickly moved to explain to the American people why such spying was necessary. As usual, the reason was national security, but the fun part in all of this was yet to come. 8 years later, in 2013, Edward Snowden would later disclose that this NSA program was far worse than people thought. Not only were the Americans spying on their citizens by wiretapping their phones, listening to their conversations, and having a program that could turn on their cameras and microphone for this purpose, they were also doing this to foreign countries, gathering intelligence on foreign nationals using their internet activities, all made possible by the giant American companies whom the whole world have come to depend on. Yes, I'm talking about Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. If you do anything at all with your mobile phones and computers, then you are intricately connected to this web of spies, lurking in the dark, waiting patiently to get their hands on your data, a data you often provide willingly, not just to these American companies, but the NSA, which in turn shares the same with their allies should there be a need to. Well, it's been 9 years since that revelation that sent shockwaves to the entire world, but what has happened since that time is even worse. The NSA now has larger data centers, and other world governments are not so opposed to this spying anymore. So what changed? And what does this mean for the future of the internet as we head into this new world order? In 2016, the FBI forced Apple to comply with a court order to break into a customer's device for the purpose of obtaining information from his iPhone 5. Well, as it turns out, the FBI already hacked this device before obtaining this court order, and they did this for formality. While this incident can be excused by claiming the said individual was under some investigation for some crime, this creates a precedent of treating citizens as guilty until proven innocent. And this is the exact premise from which the mass surveillance ideology operates, which is, what if he is guilty? The perpetrators, which are usually law enforcement, don't think about the opposite side of this question, which is, what if he is innocent? Mass surveillance usually subjects a population to indiscriminate monitoring involving a systematic interference with people's right to privacy and all the rights that privacy enables, including the freedom to express yourself and to protest. Now, if you take away a person's right to expression and tell them they cannot protest that, you see where that leads us? You have a controlled population. But what are the currently available forms of mass surveillance? You see, technology has made our lives easier. In fact, all our lives are now available online for free, and the government is doing a great job at harvesting this data and storing it for whatever purpose. Many countries throughout the world have already been adding thousands of surveillance cameras to their urban, suburban, and even rural areas. But in times when this data is not readily available to the government, they tend to take it by force. Media reports published in July 2021 exposed the use of NSO Group's phone malware software known as Pegasus for spying on rights activists, lawyers, and journalists globally by authoritarian governments. Bahrain was among the many countries listed as the Israeli firm's client, accused of hacking and conducting unauthorized mass surveillance using the phone malware. The software infects devices, allowing its operators to gain access to the target's messages, photos, record calls, and even activate the phone's camera and microphone. In China, the tools put together to filter and monitor the internet are collectively known as the Great Firewall of China. Besides the usual routing regulations that allow access to an IP address or a particular domain name to be blocked, the Great Firewall makes large-scale use of deep packet inspection technology to monitor and block access based on keyword detection. The Great Firewall has the ability to block encrypted connections, One of the country's main internet service providers, China Unicom, automatically cuts a connection as soon as it is used to transmit encrypted content. 𝗪𝗲 is a German company that builds surveillance softwares for governments around the world. In 2020, during the 𝗪𝗂𝘂𝗧𝘂𝗶𝗂 protest, the Nigerian government used social media to monitor their citizens, and when it became apparent that it would be difficult to control, the government quickly shut down Twitter in the country, making it illegal to access the social media site. The Vietnamese government uses computer viruses to monitor the internet activity and private data of dissidents protesting government policies. But why do governments need to spy on their citizens? Well, mass surveillance relies on the assumption that all information could be useful to address a hypothetical threat. But when you start to think of the fundamental values and principles of democratic societies that seek to limit the information a state knows about its people in order to moderate its power, you come to realize the big problem we have at hand. Mass surveillance has often been cited as necessary to fight terrorism, prevent crime and social unrest, protect national security, and control the population. But this eventually leads to tyranny. Now, with courts continuously ruling in favor of the government, claiming that mere surveillance creates no harm, isn't this paving the way for a surveillance state where our daily lives are utterly controlled by a select few? But while we're often quick to see surveillance as a tool for totalitarian regimes around the world, more democratic governments as well as corporations are getting on board. Surveillance is not just a game for domination anymore. Governments use it to influence and control a population. Businesses use it to get ahead of competitors. These companies make a huge amount of money from the collection, use and sale of personal data. The internet has been branded as free to use, but the real cost is paid by the users. Here's what I mean. The internet as we know it is funded by billions of transactions where advertisements are individually targeted at internet users based upon detailed profiles of their reading and consumer habits. This behavioral advertising is a multi-billion-dollar business. This forms the bedrock of companies like Google and Facebook. This means it is almost impossible for the internet to exist without this form of surveillance. The personal profiles provided to these companies are so linked that one company can tell which of its customers are pregnant just by records of their searches online or their purchase from other stores. But in some cases, these companies carry out surveillance for their countries, like Huawei for the Chinese. Amazon, Google, Microsoft and Facebook all have ties to Pentagon and the DOJ. The monitoring system developed by China is not confined to the Great Firewall alone. Monitoring is also built into social networks and chat services. Private companies are directly responsible to the Chinese authorities for surveillance of their networks to ensure banned messages are not circulated. But how are these companies able to carry out this surveillance? You see those lengthy privacy policies you don't bother to read? Deep within those documents are buried agreements for your data to be gathered, stored, sold, and distributed to the government. This allows gathering of information which would be technically illegal if performed by government agencies. This data is then often shared with government agencies, thereby in practice defeating the purpose of such privacy protections. So how does this affect you? In Bahrain, the government is one of the 5 countries whose governments are involved in active intrusive surveillance of journalists. This has resulted in grave violations of freedom of information and human rights. In China, all internet access is owned or controlled by the state or the Communist Party. If you are living in India, then you should know that the Indian Parliament passed the Information Technology Act of 2008 with no debate whatsoever, giving the government power to tap all communications without a court order or warrant. The government of the Netherlands carry out more secret wiretaps and intercept than any country in the world. Singapore is already known as a city of censors. Singapore's laws are broadly phrased to allow the government to obtain sensitive data such as text messages, email, call logs, and web surfing history from its people without the need for a court permission. State surveillance in the United Kingdom has formed part of the public consciousness since the 19th century. The vast majority of video surveillance cameras in the UK are not operated by government bodies, but by private individuals or companies, especially to monitor the interiors of shops and businesses. Modern surveillance in the United States was thought of as more of a wartime effort before Snowden disclosed in-depth information about the NSA in June 2013. So why should you be worried about all this if the reason is to protect you? Well, by systematically monitoring people's lives, mass surveillance enables the potential for unchecked state power and control over individuals. It creates an environment of threat and suspicion that is incompatible with democratic values and principles, where in the eyes of the state, all individuals become guilty until proven innocent. But what can you do about it? How do you protect your privacy? Well, as long as you're connected to the internet somehow, there is so little you can do to stop the government and these big corporations from having access to your data without your permission. But maybe you can decide to share so little about yourself and keep your private life off the internet. More and more encryption methods are being made available to journalists and other rights activists. And if you sense danger and feel like you're being watched, taking the necessary precaution of discarding your devices is always advised. The surveillance state is bound to be our new normal, so learning how to live and survive in one should be your top priority. Thank you for watching this video. Stay safe and I'll see you in the video showing up on the screen right now.